Welcome to the 2023 Global DEI Conference, a groundbreaking event presented by Ludo and One Business World, dedicated to reshaping the landscape of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are stepping into the realm of transformative discussions and actions, being part of a movement that's forging and really pushing forward with fostering equity for inclusion. I'm joined now by Kate, who is the founder and CEO of Fair HQ. Kate, welcome. I'm going to pass over to you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And hello, everyone, from wherever you're calling. Really nice to meet you. As Elizabeth mentioned, we are very excited to be part of this global initiative on ensuring that we are building equity, diversity and inclusion across the world and, closing down the barriers. Today, I'm going to be dedicating our session to the myth of unconscious bias training. It's basically this very important silver bullet that a lot of the people have been talking about, and some of you probably have tried as well. And we can unpack why it might not be its most effective solution for embracing diversity, equity, inclusion, and welcoming it within our workplace. So a bit about myself. As Elizabeth mentioned, co-founder and CEO at a company called Fair HQ. We are an all-in-one diversity, equity, inclusion platform that is basically sitting like a mini head of D&I on organizations. And we are led predominantly by the scientific evidence and behavioral science, because it's all about understanding how our brains can enable the DEI to enter our organizations, and how do we make sure that happens. I'm also personally been head of people myself before, so a lot of the people that land this agenda on their plates are people teams. So I have a lot of understanding and empathy for that work. Is one of the hardest jobs to do, and D&I is also one of the very important skills and experiences gained with it. So let's dive in. Today, what we're going to cover, we're going to look into why unconscious bias training, unfortunately, is not the silver bullet that we've been all hoping for. We're going to also talk about some of the behavioral design tips, fresh from the research, and we're going to mention one of the important case studies that we can showcase on how these behavioral tips actually helped organizations to transform the way how they think and how they act on D&I within. And if we have a couple of minutes left, we're going to also dive into some of the questions that might be relatable over here. So let's dive into a very important thing, and come with a hell of a picture. So diversity, equity, inclusion is becoming a very urgent business problem. So there's a ton of regulatory and litigation risks that organizations are facing. There's a new generation of workers, the millennials and the Gen Zs. They're going to make up to 75% of the workplace as we're speaking, the next two years or a couple more. There's a government funding, and investors are requiring from the organizations to have a really good foundations for the D&I and ESG. And as well, there's the consumers that are wanting to buy from ethical brands, and the procurement that is right now predominantly looking at supplier diversity is one of the requirements. And we know that there's about $50 billion dedicated across the world. So the pressure is really piling up, and it's piling up on the CEOs and then the board and the C-suite, but predominantly lands on the people teams. So we need to help the people teams to get through that. And as we are piling that pressure, there's a lot of tailwinds, as I mentioned. And these tailwinds are creating a pressure on increasing budgets on D&I. So we've seen them actually growing budgets in the organizations when it comes to spending on diversity, equity, inclusion, and in the need of showing it the impact. And how can we actually show that? But unfortunately, 90% of these budgets are spent on the things that really don't improve the D&I, which is one of the things that we're going to mention today. And $8 billion of those budgets is actually spent on diversity training of some sorts, predominantly of unconscious bias training, which is proven by about 418 studies that is actually not improving DEI within the organizations. And we've actually even seen it backfiring in the past. We've seen that women, ethnic minorities from the leadership levels actually left after the training, but because it just formalizes that biases are okay and actually doesn't make the change happen, which needs to be more systemic. And we're going to talk about it a bit more. So why is it so hard for our brains to change? Why do we even have these biases? Well, let's dive into our really ancient creatures that live in our heads. So our brains are very old in many structures. And today we're living in a world that is, unprecedentedly busy. It's very noisy. Our brains are receiving up to 11 million inputs of information every second. There's no way we can be alive if we are processing every single bit of these information. So, you can imagine that one of the examples would be like, have you noticed your chair right now where you're sitting? And maybe you have a bit of a stiff shoulders because you've worked all day, or just got up in the morning. Have you noticed that some of the background noise is happening behind you? Probably not. So there's so much information that our brains are receiving. If our brains were actually actively filtering that information within our consciousness, we will be completely stuck. We'll be completely paralyzed. And so what our brains have developed over time is this mechanism of filtering stuff out. And we know that up to 99% of the information that our brains receive is actually filtered out from our consciousness. So we don't even know that our brain is making decisions, but they created just this little small neural pathways of, okay, this is important, this is not important. And that's where our unconscious bias lies. That's where our brains are making those decisions that actually can be harmful for the person that we're looking at, that we're going to hire, or a person that we want to give a particular project that we want to challenge. But also it might be harmful for us because we might ourselves exclude ourselves accidentally from a challenging project or a thing that we want to do. So our biases and these small decisions are actually influencing the way how we work. And the reason why it's hard to change them is because they are not in our consciousness. So just telling us that we can change them doesn't make them go away. And I'll give you some example of this noisy decisions that has been, and some of the solutions that we've seen being made. So let's come to the concert. Let's see this in practice. So in the 1970s, the orchestra, so we're looking at it, we're like, wow, there's so many, there's only 5% of the people that we see in the orchestra that are women. How is that even possible? We know that women play music, that women enjoy music. It's not possible that 95%, of the musicians in the world are only men. So how is it possible that orchestra has that? And then they looked and they were like, well, there's probably some noisy information that is coming to, the decisions about who we're going to hire into the orchestra. And they made a small little tweak, actually 2 tweaks. First, they put a curtain in the auditorium where they're making decisions. So instead of actually seeing the person coming in, that's quickly identifying it's a woman or a man and like looking at their background, the dress, etc., all this noisy information, they just were seeing a curtain, and then the musicians started playing. So they were judging the people based on the music that they were playing rather than based on their appearance, which was very noisy and really not predictive of that person's performance in being a great musician. The second tweak that they made over time is actually they also started putting a carpet in the auditorium to make sure that they don't actually hear even women in their heels, because that would already create an expectation that this is a woman and that it might have a different results into the hiring process, as we've seen, because there were only 5% of women. So what happened as a result of these new practices, today we have about 40% of the people in the orchestra being women. So massive increase in the representation with just a couple of small tweaks that helped our brains to make the right choices, or the orchestra deciders. So that's how powerful behavioral design can be. So let's look into, if we can't fix our biases, so can we fix the minorities? Can we maybe tell women to do something differently? Maybe teach them to negotiate for the pay so we can remove gender pay gap. I did that in my previous career, and it was semi-effective, but it's not as effective systemically. Or can we actually look into fixing the structures? And fixing the structures is about creating the environment, as for example, the auditorium, that, putting the curtain over there to make sure that our brains can make really good decisions that would not be influenced by the noise information that is not relevant for that decision when we're making it. So we're going to talk about lots of behavioral design tips. I also have a tiny little plug about what we do at FAIR HQ. And I wanted to tell you that there's lots of shortcuts. So we've at FAIR HQ gathered 1,500 different studies around the world that have been gathered, scientific studies about behavioral approaches, and we put them into the product that basically does it for you. It's a companion for the people teams and talent teams. We help to assess where the biases live in the organization through our audit. We provide data where the biases live and actually help you understand what decisions you might make instead. And we also provide organizations with the scientific evidence and the strategies and interventions to help to overcome some of these inefficiencies that our brains are creating, which are creating less inclusive natural environments. And this is what we're here for. So let's not talk about the product anymore, but actually let's look into some of the fundamental advice and the scientific research that we've backed up all the thinking in FAIR HQ, and also I hope to share some with you today. So let's look at the real world example in one of the practices around the people work cycle, which is the hiring process. And let's look at affinity bias as one of the examples of the biases that is very commonly introduced in the times we're making small snippets of decisions. So affinity bias is all about that we would like to be associated with the people that are quite similar to us. So we're more likely to choose people that are similar to us or to stereotype that we have about that particular role. So that's where the affinity bias actually plays in. And we know from the research that actually the name and the university where the people are coming to, or a specific student bodies that they've attended, can actually influence our decision making, the hobbies, etc. This is all relevant information about if that person is going to be effective for their job and if they should be actually shortlisted as part of the process. So there was a great research that have been done by universities. So there was a great university in the US that did research, and they looked at CVs and they looked at, okay, so hiring managers look predominantly about 7 seconds on particular survey. 7 seconds, very small amount of time where, of course, our brains needs to make a lot of decisions on our behalf. And then they conducted an experiment. In one experiment, they had a CV where there was a person that had a very typical, stereotypical name that was associated more with the Black community, Lamar J. Smith. Then they created a second CV with a person that they basically whitened the name, as they call it, and they looked into, and they met L. James Smith. So these two people were exactly the same. They also removed some of the universities where the person went and the history and the address, etc. But they kept the CV predominantly the same and only removed the unimportant information that would be noisy for our brains. What happened is, as part of that experiment, the person that had the whitened name and the whitened CV actually received up to 70% higher callbacks. So what does it mean? It means that actually these small irrelevant information create a massive impact on what opportunities this person will be offered. So my tip number one for you today is going to be either about ditching CVs, which you probably heard about many times, or about trying to blind them. And of course, this comes with a caveat. We know that in some environments where there has been done lots of awareness training, sometimes these elements might not play like role anymore. So blinding CVs might not be helpful. But actually, instead of using CVs, we might be using some information that people provide us in a short couple of questions that might be helpful to do that instead of looking at a paper. So another great example that I wanted to share with you is all about isolation choice effect. So example is that let's say you're hiring a salesperson and you're looking at their CV and you're kind of assessing 3 candidates for that one particular role. If you are hiring for a sales team and like composition of the team, you might actually look into you might be looking at more like a puzzle. What are the people that I need on my team and how do they can interact together? How they can actually create a better puzzle and a better sales outcomes if they work together. So often we look and assess one candidate at a time for one particular role, but which is the isolated choice that we're actually making for that particular role. But we know from the research, if we start creating a puzzle or a team, it actually creates a completely different mindset in our brains. And we start looking at how those people can complement each other. Where are the different gaps that they actually have and how they can work together. So I would always recommend just try hiring for roles in bulk as next recommendation. And as you're hiring in the bulk, you also are providing the people an understanding that they might be working with other people to complement their skills and the strength. And you might be at that point looking at a completely different skill set. You might be hiring someone super senior or someone more junior, which you might be from more commonly from unrepresented backgrounds if it's a very traditional industry. So that's another bias and another tip. So let's talk about now moving from the hiring process, let's move on to the performance process and look into the biases that the raters of the performance actually might have. And that will be specifically related to stereotype of what gender struggle, for example, what women should be good at or should have skills for compared to, for example, men. So there was a great study. I looked into the performance reviews and analyzed about 200 performance reviews at the time. And they found out that actually women were much more likely by about 20% get a very vague feedback, which was, for example, teams really like you, just keep doing what you're doing. This is not going to help that individual person to improve and look at the things that they might be, improving in terms of way how they, for example, present themselves or how they deliver the outcomes. It's a very vague feedback, and women were much more likely to get it. We know actually from other research that ethnic minorities tend to face very similar type of feedback more commonly. And often it's because there's not enough evidence, but also there's a gender bias that the people might not, have against that, or they might not have enough evidence about the performance of the individual. So when they reviewed the second part of when they start reviewing the performance reviews again, they looked and said, okay, so what might be like what type of feedback actually men are more likely to get than the women. And they did look at, and they saw first that men are much more likely to get a very specific outcome-driven feedback. And it was actually by, I think men got it by at 60% of the cases, and a woman only 40%. There's again 20% difference between that amount of feedback that was given to men or women. That will be constructive feedback and will be outcome-driven. It can actually help the individual to make better decisions, where they're going to focus, how they're going to improve, or what they should actually celebrate, or what decisions are valued and behaviors are valued in the organizations where they're applying for. So here comes a couple of behavioral design tips for you. And they're super simple. That's what is beautiful about behavioral design, because they're about tricking our brains to do the right thing. So first one is about tell your managers around performance review that their performance feedback will be reviewed. This small tweaks was shown to have a significant impact on people's experience in the performance reviews, because people, when they know that there'll be someone checking it, their brains are thinking about, okay, I might need to actually look across all the people that I've been reviewing and make sure that I compare the reviews and make sure they're more equitable. So our brains are actually already tricked to do the right thing and get more evidence if we need to for one individual over the other. And as we know, people from less traditional backgrounds, for more underrepresented groups, the managers tend to have a less stronger relationship sometimes, and they might create less evidence for the performance review and then create more vague rating. Another trick, which is amazing and super easy to do again, set a minimum or a maximum count for feedback, which again tricks our brains to make sure we get enough evidence and a similar amount of evidence for each candidate. And actually, we've seen massive outcomes from these, and we've seen that the vagueness have disappeared from the performance reviews, and they start to become more equitable. So let's dive into one of our last behavioral design tips for today, and I hope it just inspires you how behavioral design can be super powerful in the way of helping our brains do the right thing when naturally we might not be prone to. So another thing looks into the biases that we might actually not host in our decision-making powers when we're deciding about, for example, who we're going to promote. But let's look at the bias that people might have from the perspective when they're applying for promotions, because the candidates for the promotions within our teams actually also might struggle from some stereotyping. And so we know from the research that women and ethnic minorities specifically are less likely to put themselves forward. And there are reasons for that. They're more critical around their performance. They might not feel comfortable that they check every single box. You've probably seen that already, and it's the same for hiring process. And they're more likely to have received a critical feedback before that was related to a specific element. They just might not feel as confident and might have less buy-in from the leadership, where they might have less strong connection, that they would actually help them pick up the couple of points that they might not be as good as to actually feel that they should apply for the promotion. So there's a very, very simple tip. Again, behavioral design is so wonderful because it shows us how easy it is to implement small change that can have a massive impact. So I would recommend, before your next promotion reviews, I'll look into them and say, like, okay, instead of actually publishing the role for like who can be the next next level engineer, or who should we promote when it comes to the sales manager, and like let people apply, make it by default that you're going to assess every single person in that particular role, and then look at their performance and look at like the contributions, the outcomes of their jobs, and make it opt out. So if someone doesn't want to be promoted, they need to actively actually opt themselves out from the promotions rather than opt in for the promotion. This small change can have a massive impact on the equitability, the time of, for example, women and ethnic minorities being promoted compared to their peers, such as white men. And it's just so brilliant how simple it is, but how effective it is. Well, these are the 5 behavioral tips that I wanted to share with you today. And I hope they will be really helpful for you to implement within your business. So now let's look into practice and a really quick case study that I wanted to share with you today. So this case study is focusing on one of our customers, one of our early customers called Beamer. There are about 500 employees, about I think 600-700 employees right now, based in multiple locations. And they've always been super passionate about D&I, just because it's been part of their mission, their HR tech as well business. But they've kept talking about D&I all the time. It's been like one of the things that they've all talked about. They have a D&I committee, they had some initiatives, but they never felt they're actually achieving anything. So one thing that was amazing is that what they put together is that they started creating some of the plans. And once they started working with us, they said that they started to bring them the great research and the best practices. And it was fantastic how measurable and forward-looking the D&I became over time, and helped them sell the story of like how should they more work on it over time. And what outcomes they achieved when they started using behavioral design is they improves the ethnic minority representation by 30%, improve the inclusion by 100%, and actually close the gap for inclusion for LGBTQ community, and improves the fairness and equitability of the performance reviews by 3x. And these are the key things that they've done. They first audited their company for the biases and processes when they have in their hiring process, performance, and things. Then they've created a specific goals that are related to how do we going to tackle those, and a very first strategy. Then they created committee for fairness, that they called it, which is a brilliant name, to be honest. Instead of committee for D&I, it was a committee for fairness that was assessing and cross-checking the performance reviews and the progression within the organization, which created accountability, and managers felt that they need to deliver a very equitable feedback. And there's so many more things that they've done, but I wanted to just show you that small changes can have a massive impact. And you don't need to have a ton of big resources, but you just need to spend time on the things that will matter. And I would suggest it's not going to be unconscious bias training. So I hope that together we're going to be building more actionable features for the next generations to come. And I'm very happy to talk and answer any of your questions you might have right now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we have some questions already. So if there could be, if we can showcase, the tips. Oh, sorry, yes. This tip slide. We're gonna share the presentation later with you, so we can dive into them. I'm gonna try to maybe quickly bring it forward, but we're gonna share it after that. So you should hopefully have it all together. But
yeah,
please,
we'll share it for sure.
Absolutely. And we have actually 5 minutes for questions. I've been quite impressed by the time.
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes. I just really wanted to thank you and just really wrap up and bring to you some of the things that really resonated for me. This really important piece around affinity bias and understanding and diving into that a bit was really helpful to me. And I was really shocked by the stat of 70% increase in callbacks just by shifting the name to L. James Smith. I think that's a real wake-up call to any of our listeners, anybody who's watching this live or in playback, of what can we be doing to, as you say, the words you used, trick our brains to do the right thing, and just sort of circumnavigate that bias that we know we all have bias. And even when we have an awareness of it, it's still very difficult to shift it. But by removing the process in which it allows us to follow that bias, I think that's incredibly powerful. So I found that really, really helpful. Thank you so much, Kate. That was brilliant.
Very glad it helped. And, just to mention for the listeners today, there are about thousands of small tweaks like that we can do, but they might not be all relevant for your business. A lot about like where you at on your journey, what is it you're trying to achieve, is really always important. So some of these things might be more relevant than the others, but there is so much more wealth of evidence, and I hope to be bringing more and more of it forward, and there's more resources. Happy to share any if anyone is interested.
Amazing. Kate, thank you so much for your time today. That was so powerful.
Absolutely.
Really great to have you with us today. Thank you.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Have a really wonderful day, everyone, and good luck on your path of making your companies more accessible and fair.
Thank you.